Привit, moi druzy. Hello, my friends. My name is Darren Gerdes. I'm a professor who tries to help you understand what's going on, gives you some context of what's happening in Ukraine. Last night after dinner, I was thinking, so what's really going on? What's going on in the big picture? Not the specific events, but when I look at the big picture, I mean, things are going really well. So I want to focus on the good news. Let me give you quickly the bad news, and then I'll give you the good news, and then I'll give you a broad version of the good news, and then some of the specifics of the good news so that you can see what I'm thinking about. So first, the bad news. Russia's still there. That's bad news number one. Russia had 190,000, almost 200,000 when they invaded, and they have another 300,000 that have flooded in after. That's two. Russia has shown no lack of will to keep going. I mean, Putin has shown no lack of will to keep fighting. That's three. Russia's using missiles to terrorize cities. That's four. But even the bad news is good news. Here's what I mean. Russia's still there. Well, Russia thought that they were going to roll over Ukraine in 3 days and in 3 weeks have the entire country. But they're still there, but isolated to these four oblasts that they have acquired, as they think. And they're still there because they can't actually achieve their objectives. They rolled in with 190,000, and now we're looking at more than that being casualties. And they backfilled it with 300,000, but look what the Ukrainians have done so far. They're shooting missiles at cities because they can't actually kill the troops with that, and they think that that's going to be a good strategy to make the people resist because they don't seem to understand the Ukrainian people. Okay, so that is how I think about even the bad news, but here's, and that's not to gloss it over or say that it's not bad. There are some bad things, but when you put it in perspective, it's really different. In recent days, we had a few incidents that I think are just well worth paying attention to, like this kamikaze drone that struck the oil refinery. This is huge, and it's bigger than it even looks like because of what it represents, the symbolism, the meaning. And this is what the factory looks like, or the oil refinery looks like. This is in the Kyiv Post, and here is Sycamus and what he had to say about it. So I'm going to show you that right now.
Interesting news here. Sevastopol in Crimea has been hit again. This video showing a burning oil refinery and depot at Kozaka Bay near Sevastopol harbour in Crimea. And as you can see on the videos, this is a huge fire. It's not just one single oil tank burning, but it looks like pretty much the entire refinery is ablaze. Now, we don't have too much information yet, but we do have a time. This took place at 4:30 AM, and it was said to be a UAV. Given the size of the blaze, I would say it seems that multiple UAVs were used here. Here's a map of the refinery which is hit. I've measured it as being roughly 680 metres from end to end. If we zoom out, we can see its location relative to Sevastopol harbour. So it's to the south of the harbour, not in the main harbour itself, but one of the smaller bays outside it, so not where the military ships are stored. Zoomed out again, we can see it's almost 300 kilometres to Odessa, the likely launching point for drones.
Now, what's interesting about this is look at where they've been able to hit. Okay, if we know that the military is right in here, or right up here, and the refinery is right there, that puts the Russians on alert. Like, hey, we can come get you, which is absolutely amazing. The psychological toll, having to pull back weapons and hold off air defense in reserve rather than be able to push to the front. I talked about that the other day. I think that's really amazing. So now it's been, 6 months, and the Russians still haven't been able to take Bakhmut? That's good news. Now, they've driven them to the edge of the city. Fair. But in 6 months, they've driven them to the edge of the city? Like, that's not really a major accomplishment. And why do the Russians really care about Bakhmut anyway? Well, according to Politico, Russia throws more soldiers into the Bakhmut meat grinder ahead of Putin's Victory Day parade. They need a win. They haven't had one since Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, and so they need a big win right now. And that's why they're really driving. At the same time, Prighozhin is threatening to pull out of Bakhmut if he doesn't get the ammunition that he needs. So the Wagner boss threatens Bakhmut withdrawal. This was just 2 days ago, unless his forces get more munitions. He says, I'm appealing to Sergei Shoigu with a request to issue ammunition immediately. Now, if this is refused, I deem it necessary to inform the commander-in-chief about the existing problems and make a decision regarding the feasibility of continuing to station units in the settlement of Bakhmut, given the current shortage of ammunition. That they're at odds with each other, I find absolutely amazing. I think it's a great thing because it's costing Russian efficiency. But he's also talking about that they're lacking ammunition. So I don't know that he means to project that, but that's another side byproduct of what's going on. And then we turn our attention to something a little larger, some global picture. China and India voted for a UN resolution that had a reference to, it wasn't all about condemning Russia, but it had a reference to Russia's aggression, and they weighed in with it. China and India, two countries that have carefully avoided condemning Moscow for launching the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, despite repeated pleas from Western allies, have voted in favor of a UN resolution that explicitly acknowledges, quote, the aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine. And Kazakhstan, Armenia, and Brazil, Russia, China, and India and South Africa are the BRICS. So China, India, and Brazil all voted for this resolution that acknowledged the aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine. That's absolutely amazing. Then just yesterday, a Russian journalist was asking Speaker McCarthy about, when is the supplies going to dry up? We know you're against Ukraine, and so when will you stop sending weapons to Ukraine? And
not sure. The sound here is not good. Did he say, I don't support aid to Ukraine? No, I vote for aid for Ukraine. I support aid for Ukraine. I do not support what your country has done to Ukraine. I do not support your killing of the children either. And I think for one standpoint, you should pull out. And I don't think it's right. And we will continue to support because the rest of the world sees it just as it is.
Well, that was a full-throated support of Ukraine from the Speaker of the House of Representatives. Like, you understand that the Speaker of the House is second in line after the Vice President in succession. Like, if something happened to the President of the United States and the Vice President, that's the person that would take over as President of the United States, the Speaker of the House. So he's an important player. Okay, then we also had this, that the U.S., John Kirby talked about this, that the U.S. believes that Russians have lost 100,000 casualties in Ukraine in the last 5 months alone. Now that's on top of the previous, what's happened, another 100,000 or so as of November or December, according to U.S. estimates, which are on the conservative side. Here's John Kirby talking about this to Greta Van Susteren.
Though, as we said today, since just December, in the fighting in the Donbass, particularly around a little town called Bakhmut, the Russians have suffered 100,000 casualties, over 20,000 killed in action. And of that 20,000, and again, this is just since December, and just in the Donbass area, about half of that 20,000, we estimate, were Wagner employees, mercenaries, mostly convicts that Mr. Prighozhin went and let out of prison to go throw them at the fight at Bakhmut.
Okay, now for clarification, he wasn't saying that they were all these casualties were at Bakhmut. So let's make sure that's clear. He also was saying that these are maybe 20,000 or so killed and the rest casualties wounded. Okay, so but nonetheless, 100,000 casualties killed or wounded, according to the U.S.'s very conservative estimates compared to other estimates, within the last 5 months. That's on top of, again, the previous 100,000 or so estimated. So that's what's going on there. Now, you know that I'm kind of a glutton for punishment, and I showed you this gentleman, Stephen Gardner, doing an interview with Scott Ritter just the other day. He's doing the same thing with Douglas McGregor, and here's what he has to say with Douglas McGregor. We're going to talk about the oil refinery. I'm only going to show you a brief clip. The oil refinery issue, and how they don't trust the mainstream media. Okay, here we go.
The Russia-Ukraine war and other things going on with the U.S. military and the U.S. government. Colonel McGregor, thank you for being on today's show.
Sure.
So over the weekend, black smoke filled the air of Russia's Crimea region after an oil refinery was hit with a kamikaze drone from Ukraine. Two things. Do you think this attack was brought on in part by Victoria Nuland of the state bragging about U.S. military having intel on Crimea and the fact that those were open targets? Or is this Ukraine hitting Crimea in retaliation for the missile strikes a few days prior to that?
The strike that you're referring to was executed with an unmanned aerial vehicle that is a one-way operation. You call it a kamikaze drone. It destroyed one oil tank. The refinery is continuing to operate.
Actually, this is line number one for Douglas Macgregor. We'll let him talk for a moment, and then I'll show you what happened.
How many they fired or launched against this target in Crimea is unclear, and it was in Sevastopol, by the way. And the gasoline, oil, diesel, and so forth in Sevastopol is completely unrelated to the conduct of ground operations in Ukraine. So it has...
Well, kind of shading the truth here, because what's actually going to happen is that the military has to pull back and protect here. So it's not completely unrelated to the ground operations, but he's kind of right in the sense that that's not related to the Army itself. Might be related to the Navy.
There's no operational impact whatsoever. And having struck only one tank...
Again, he's doubling down on that one tank theory.
Quite frankly, it's not going to make any difference to maritime operations for the Russians either.
But yes, it's going to have an impact. How can it not? They have to now be very vigilant in the port of Sevastopol.
Almost more symbolic than anything else.
Now, there he's almost onto something. It is symbolic, but it's also showing they can reach you. So it's not just symbolic.
As far as the strikes that went in over the last 48 hours, they're very important. And I think it's useful to pause and talk a little bit about it.
Now, before he goes on...
Because it indicates a change.
Now, before he goes on and talks about that, the strikes in the last 48 hours, and he's talking about Russian strikes now, let's see what Succumus has to say. This is his updated video on the strike.
On last night's drone attack on the oil storage facility in Sevastopol, Crimea. As you can see in this video, which has been shared online, the fire is now partially extinguished. Surprisingly, this was achieved quicker than I thought, given the size of the blaze that we saw earlier. We also have this single drone screenshot showing the damage caused, and it looks pretty bad.
That doesn't look like
It's looking like one of these two silos here is what got hit, and the rest of the damage to the facility is caused by the fire. And as you can see, it says...
So maybe Macgregor was telling the truth that only one was hit, but many were damaged, so it's not the same as what he was leading you to believe.
They did a number of these tanks. Many of them are blackened and fire damaged. Here's a Google Maps image. So one of these two tanks is what was hit. Now, while some of them are standing still, all of these tanks are interconnected. So I've seen it mentioned by some that this entire facility is now a write-off. Even though some of the tanks are still standing, they'll have internal damage and that sort of thing. This oil storage facility is one which supplied the Black Sea Fleet, so we're going to have to wait and see if its loss will have an impact on operations from there. Russian sources said that 4 tanks were damaged, but on the screenshot from the drone here, we can clearly see that more than 4 were damaged.
Okay, so you have a choice here. Macgregor says only 1 was damaged. Russian sources says 4 were damaged, and it looks like maybe if they're all interconnected, even more than that might have been.
2 of them were completely destroyed. Now, as to how many drones were used in the attack, it depends on the source. Some Russian Telegram pages are claiming that 10 Mugen 5 drones were used and claim that 9 were shot down. Other sources say 2 drones were used, with 1 of them down. Russia has provided...
The difficulty is you can't believe what Russian media says, and so you can't really tell how many it's going to be. Okay, let's go back to the interview with Colonel Macgregor and see what else he has to say.
Targeting strategy on the Russian side. You'll recall that over several months, the Russians focused first and foremost on the energy grid. Then, in addition to the energy grid, they began to attack the air defense network. Even though the Ukrainians never had a fully integrated air defense system like the Russians, they still wanted to eliminate as much, if not all, of the air defense systems they could so that they would be able to use their air power without interruption. Now what they've done, having destroyed virtually all of the air defense capability, is that they're focusing on a very new set of targets that tells you something about what's coming when the ground dries and Russian ground forces can attack.
Okay, as to the air defense capability, Ukraine's been getting backfill of other things like Patriot missile systems and other things along those lines, but I keep hearing Russian commentators talk about they have no air defense, they have no air defense, how are they going to be able to survive? We'll see that soon enough.
Over the last 48 hours, the Russians went after clusters of ammunition, armored fighting vehicles, and troops. One of the most important target-rich areas includes the rail yard in Kramatorsk. And in that rail yard, the Ukrainians had built up 200 tons of ammunition. The 200 tons of ammunition, which is very important to Ukraine right now since it's virtually running out of ammunition, that 200-ton ammunition storage point was completely destroyed.
Now, I know that the Russians have a hard time keeping their ammunition, and Prighozhin talked about that same thing. I don't know if the Ukrainians are running out of ammunition, but let's assume, for the sake of argument, that they don't want to have their ammunition destroyed either. He's saying that the Russians destroyed this 200 tons of ammunition.
So the Ukrainians lost all of that ammunition. In addition to that...
Now, before he goes on, I can't find any Western sources verifying that. I find it being published by Russian state media and then regurgitated by other friendly countries regurgitating the Russian state media. But I can't find any Western legitimate news sources saying that that has actually taken place. Now, that doesn't mean that it hasn't. It just means that I'm skeptical until I can find and triangulate on news sources that don't repeatedly and intentionally lie.
They destroyed somewhere between 20 and 40 armored fighting vehicles. I don't know how many of these were on rail cars and how many of these were on the ground. I have no way of knowing. They also hit something in the neighborhood of about 9 Ukrainian brigade headquarters, killing 1,000 Ukrainian soldiers. This is important because the Ukrainians, of course, desperately need competent officers. They've lost a lot of officers, just as they've lost most of their well-trained fighters. So the 9 brigades that were struck resulted in rather serious losses in terms of competent leadership.
Now, what I find interesting here is that he believes Russian media reports, but then he has a hard time with the mainstream media. Now, I don't particularly like the mainstream media in some regards because, you know, as a conservative, I find that they tend to be slanted. But as far as journalistic integrity, if I have to throw my hat in with the mainstream media or with Russian state media, there's no contest.
So there is, frankly, no ability on the Ukrainian side at this point to protect forces as they move forward to close with the Russians.
Now, he's been singing that tune for a long time about it's over for Ukraine. There's no possible way. They have no ability. I've heard him say it, and then I've seen the Ukrainians have ability. So if I'm skeptical, there's a reason.
So I think those strikes were a hugely successful operation. And frankly speaking, the loss of the one oil tank up at Sevastopol may look good on television, but it's largely irrelevant to the outcome of operations.
Okay, so it was more the mainstream media needing to keep this narrative that Ukraine is striking back, that they are doing well, that they are equal to the task of taking on the Russian Federation army. But in the end, it was just a bunch of black smoke, literally.
Yeah, so see how it's the mainstream media that they're skeptical of. The Western reporters that are free to do reporting with journalistic integrity, those are the ones not to believe. Okay, for all those reasons, all the reasons that I listed, for the bad news through all of these examples of holding Bakhmut or Prighozhin fighting or China and the UN, actually looking like they're leaning in against Russia a little bit, McCarthy, 100,000 casualties, and the way that these guys are so jaded and can't really see beyond Russian state media, I think this is good news. It's good news for Ukraine. They're positioned about as well as they can be expected to be positioned, given all the things thrown against them. And I think they have a really good chance. All right, so that's it. If you're still with me, thank you for spending the time to listen to my case about why I think things are going well in Ukraine. Thank you for the likes. Thank you for the super thanks. Thank you for buying me coffee. Thank you for being the kind of person that was willing to listen to this for the last 20 minutes when you could have been doing something else. But more than anything else, thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.